Hello, everyone. A very warm welcome to you from wherever you are in the world. We're delighted that you could join us on this fabulous topic. Something that's very dear to my heart is lean, learning, and doing. And we've got just a couple of housekeeping slides just to set the space as a safe and inclusive space. So feel free to type your name and where you're from and how you're feeling in the chat. And then also at any stage, use the chat for questions. We'll have space for that during the session. And also, yeah, I think most of all, just have fun. There'll be some other links that you can check in during the session. And with that, I will just invite you to strap in for a little 2-minute intro video that explains a little bit more context around this whole week. So feel free to bop your head to the music.
Catalyst 2030 started life as a WhatsApp group among social entrepreneurs, connecting to envision real transformational change. Launched at the World Economic Forum in January 2020, it's grown into a global movement accelerating change to ensure the SDGs are reached by 2030. Fueled by passion, our 550 members working in 175 countries have collectively put in an amazing 50,000 volunteer hours, touching the lives of 2 billion people. And we're driven by values, to which we hold ourselves accountable. 2020 was a busy year, co-creating 3 reports with partners and producing one of our own. Inviting high-level guests to participate in the Catalyzing Change campaign, hosting fireside chats and expert hours, which will be continuing in 2021. To celebrate our achievements, together we placed our supporters in the limelight with the first Catalyst 2030 Awards for Systemic Change. With the blessing of the Dalai Lama, we celebrated finalists and winners in the following categories: special recognition for our early supporters, individual philanthropists, donor organizations, philanthropic intermediaries, corporate organizations, bi- and multilateral organizations, and 4 regional winners in the category of national governments. And now on to Catalyzing Change Week 2021. During this social entrepreneur-led event, we bring together diverse stakeholders in over 100 sessions to showcase their systems change efforts and the best practices that can accelerate our work in pursuit of the SDGs.
Superb. And with that, I shall hand the microphone to Dan to be your host for this session. Cheers.
Thanks, Nick, and thanks everyone for joining today. We're very excited for this next hour and the fantastic speakers we've got. My name is Dan Berelowitz, and I founded Spring Impact. I founded Spring Impact out of the place of where most good things come, which is frustration. Frustration at seeing teams of people changing the world in some way, but somehow not being able to take that change to a significant scale. And I became obsessed, I think it's fair to say, with how you get teams to go through their journey to impact and achieve the change that their potential and the change that they're able to. So in going through that journey now with around 300 organizations in the last 10 years, I got incredibly frustrated with how much time people spend planning. I think within the social sector, we often spend a lot of time planning a year ahead, 3 years ahead, sometimes even 5 years ahead. I'm sure many of you have filled out log frames, theories of changes, detailed project plans, when in actual fact, after we've done all that planning, we try our idea in reality only to discover that all the plans didn't quite work and we need to shift and change what we're doing. And so a couple of years ago, after taking this planning approach for some time, and being frustrated, I met Chang, who has now gone on to write a book, Lean Impact, that we'll talk about in a moment. And Anne-May just put together this incredible methodology for really searching for an idea to create scale, really learning, creating feedback loops that allow you to learn by doing. And for the last couple of years, we've had the privilege now of working with Anne-May with a number of different organizations and just seen some exceptional results. So today what we're going to be doing is talking through how you can most effectively learn by doing in the real world. We're going to hear a bit from Anne-May Chang, some of the underlying methodologies and theories, and then delighted to introduce Maryana Iskander from Harambee, CEO of Harambee Youth Employment Accelerator in South Africa, and Valeria Duflot, who's the co-founder of the Overtourism solution in Venice, who are going to be two case studies of lean impact, learning through doing in practice. So welcome. Anne-May. Anne-May is a leading expert on social innovation and the author of Lean Impact, How to Innovate for Radically Greater Social Good. Anne-May served as the Chief Innovation Officer at USAID and the first Executive Director of the US Global Development Lab, engaging in the best practices for innovation from Silicon Valley to accelerate the impact and scale of solutions to the world's most intractable challenges. Anne-May, pleasure to be talking to you again. We'd love just to hear from you some of the, as I say, some of the underlying principles of lean impact.
Thank you so much, Dan, and thank you all for having me here today. I'm just going to share some brief slides to give you a little bit of an overview to anchor this conversation. As you all probably are very familiar with, even before COVID-19, we were already falling short on the global goals. And now, of course, much of our progress over the past 2 decades has been erased by the pandemic. And so in the face of this extreme uncertainty, where both our existing solutions are clearly insufficient and the world is facing ongoing disruption, we clearly need a new approach, one that emphasizes the speed of learning. In the coming years, I believe that having a nimble organization is going to be far more important than having the perfect solution. Think about it. The perfect solution from a year ago is unlikely to still be the perfect solution today. And the perfect solution today is unlikely to still be the perfect solution a year from now. So in writing the book Lean Impact, I was lucky enough to interview over 200 of the most successful mission-driven organizations, including Harambee on the call today. And from these discussions, 3 key principles stood out as keys to their success. Think big, start small, and relentlessly seek impact. So I just want to touch on these briefly today, starting with think big, where we want to ask ourselves the question, are we being ambitious enough to truly move the needle for the problem that we aim to tackle? Now, when we focus on short-term delivery rather than long-term scale, we can experience that initial spurt of interest because funders are drawn to an exciting new idea, but then find that our trajectory flattens out over time because we reach the limits of traditional funding. I've seen this all too often in traditional global development programs. On the other hand, if we hope to scale to the size of the need, we need to pay less attention to the total number of people we've reached and more attention to the slope of the curve. That is, do we have an engine that will both sustain and accelerate growth over time? In this case, you might notice that progress may initially seem slow, that you're reaching fewer people in those initial stages than you would with a logarithmic growth approach because you're testing and iterating and searching for a pathway to impact that scale, which usually requires moving beyond grants to a more sustainable source of funding. Now, once you've laid out that big ambition and have a potential solution in hand, it's tempting to start just delivering as fast as you can. But while it might seem counterintuitive, the reality is we'll make a bigger difference if we start small. Because by starting small, we can speed up our pace of learning and thereby maximize our impact. One of the things that shocked me most when I moved from Silicon Valley into global development is, like Dan, how much people like to plan. We hold design meetings, we do research, we write proposals, we refine those proposals. Does that sound familiar to anyone? By the time an idea meets the real world, a lot of risk has built up. People don't always behave as we expect. And of course, conditions in the world change. So when we place a big bet like this and fail, we fail big. So instead, if we recognize that we don't have all the answers, then we can shift to an iterative process for design. That is, get a solution out more quickly, see what works, then improve. This way, when we fail small. And we're essentially learning by doing. Now, for a successful social innovation, there's three critical dimensions we need to test, validate, and optimize: value, impact, and growth. Value is a question: is this really something people want and will demand? Does it satisfy a deeply felt need? Second is impact. It's not enough that people want it. Does it work? Does it move the needle on the problem you're aiming to tackle? And third is growth. If it works, what is the driver that can accelerate growth over time to truly reach the need? What I found is many organizations and tools tend to focus on just one or two of these, but if we miss one, we could have a great solution that reaches very few people, or one that reaches a lot of people but doesn't have much impact. And finally, to get from those small experiments to our big vision for success, we need to stay relentlessly focused on our pursuit of impact. This can be a difficult mindset shift because NGOs are often intimately identified with their solution. But as both the problem and the constraints shift, it's important to stay rooted in the felt needs of those who we serve, which in some cases may involve rethinking our approach. So if we truly care about maximizing impact, we need to hold on to our current solutions lightly and look to the data to learn what's most effective. So I'm going to stop there and turn it back over to Dan so that we can have a discussion with some of these principles in mind.
Thanks so much, Anne-May. That's great to hear some of the underpinning ideas. Maybe could you just share an idea about what in your mind makes a really good experiment? What does that look like in reality?
Yeah, great question, Dan. I think a lot of times people conflate experiments with pilots. Pilots is just something that I think happens after you've run some experiments. So I'd suggest three things that I think are key to a great experiment. The first is that it's quick and cheap as possible. What you're trying to do with an experiment is learn something new. You're not trying to validate your whole solution. You're trying to learn something new. And ideally, you want to focus on whatever the biggest risk is, whatever the biggest unknowns are about your solution, define a clear hypothesis, and then narrowly focus that experiment on answering the question. An ideal experiment should be on the order of a day or a week, not much longer than that. In some cases, it may need to be longer, but we want to really think about how do we do this as quickly as possible, and in particular, ensure that the experiment takes a lot less time and money than the full solution would. So that way, the intent is that you're saving time and money by learning something much more quickly than you would by deploying the full solution. The second is, what we want to do in that experiment is measure behavior or action. We don't want to just ask people, do you like this? Do you like that? That's not a very accurate way of getting a read on what people will actually do. So we want to measure behavior. And one of the ways to do that is add some friction. Make it hard for people to do what you're hoping they'll do. And if they do it anyway, then you know you're on the right track, whether that is validating whether someone will adopt, will come to your training, whether someone will pay for your service or otherwise. And finally, the third is, in advance, set a meaningful metric for success. I think a lot of times we run a pilot and we hope for the best and we come up with some way to call it a success regardless of what happens. So set metrics in advance to say, will it really take for us to believe this is on the right path? And define that success metric and hold yourselves accountable to it.
Thank you. It's so clear the way you break it down, and obviously we've now been working together for some time. That each of these ideas was a real revelation for me, and things like deciding what success constitutes before you actually start the test sounds easy. In reality, is really hard when things don't work out to actually turn around and say, this hasn't worked, let's look for another solution. So some of these things really powerful, and then actually getting them to work in reality is tough but important. And to speak to that, Maryana, very, very excited to have you here. Maryana is, as I said, the CEO of Harambee Youth Employment Accelerator. Harambee is a social enterprise that designs African solutions to the global challenge of unemployment. And Maryana, you bring a real track record of scaling organizations through partnerships, data-driven delivery, talent management, technology. And at Harambee, you have done the most extraordinary things. So maybe you could start just by giving us an overview of Harambee, where you started and where you are now.
Thanks, Dan, for having me. It's such a pleasure to talk about my favorite book in the whole world, which is Lean Impact. I mean, just to say briefly, Harambee focuses on youth unemployment. Our model has changed significantly, in large part because we really adhere to this principle of staying in love with the problem and letting go of solutions as our model has evolved. We started working with about 40 young people, helping place them with about 5 employers, and at the time had 1 government partner. We now have a network of close to 1.5 million young people, work with about 600 different partners and with government partners across the road. And we have grown and scaled not as a straight line, but very much to Anmei's graph, just up and down, up and down, up and down. So really excited to talk about how these kind of lean impact principles come to life for us, Dan.
That's great. Well, I mean, maybe you could speak to that. How have you used lean throughout that journey? My understanding is it's pretty baked into the sort of DNA of the organization. Is that right?
I mean, not only because I like Anmei, but I can't say enough how much the principles of lean impact for us are deep in our DNA. It's a book we require new people to read when they join the organization. The phrase "stay in love with the problem and not your solution," a lot of our people say it. Some of them are not sure that it's come from lean impact, but it's a way to stay honest. Am I in love with what I'm doing, or am I really focused on what's needed? And having the courage to let go of your solutions or stop doing things, I think for us has been a really, really important principle. I think the other thing that Anmei said that I think has been true in our organization is that this principle of experiment quickly. So I would say most things are in a week. What are we going to learn in a week? And then how do we change that for the next week? And I think that and if I just give 2 concrete examples, the one is that we were trying to find a solution for how to improve English language communications amongst young people in Rwanda, because a lot of the work was in the tourism sector and English was a requirement. We did a revolutionary thing. We asked young people what they thought would help them. And in sort of a small group of young people helped us catch on to the idea that listening to and watching popular TV was the answer. And so we designed an experiment where they watched episodes of Friends, which again, we got to that solution by asking them what they watched. It was subtitled so they could practice hearing and seeing English words together. And within a week, we had learned enough to have a sense what was working, what wasn't working, and changed it so that by the end of kind of 3 iterations of that over a 3-week cycle, we're able to get to a solution. The place that we've used lean, I know Anmei talks about starting small, but actually thinking big, is that when the COVID hard lockdown was announced in South Africa, we had a 3-week period that was going to be a very, very intense lockdown. By listening to our customers, we realized that most young people didn't know there was a lockdown, like they hadn't heard the news. This wasn't really in their kind of orbit of how they got information. And so we decided to launch a 3-week campaign to literally try to reach like 9 million young people in the country to communicate with them about what was happening. Established a kind of campaign approach where we had a set of hypotheses that we met about at 9 in the morning. We met at 5 p.m. to see what worked. We changed it for the next day at 9. We met at 5. And it was that iteration that actually allowed us to reach 9 million young people over that period of time by having, again, to Anmei's point, a daily way of learning and changing what happens the very next day. So I just wanted to offer those as maybe some concrete examples.
That's great. And the numbers are mind-boggling, how you're able to apply the methodology and reach so many. I guess one of the challenges I've seen is it is really hard when things don't work to say, this hasn't worked, we're putting it aside and we're moving on. And I'm sure that happens within your organization, and you've had to deal with that and deal with the mindset of staff who are used to succeeding and not wanting to do that. I mean, maybe could you share an example or a story of where that has happened and how you've dealt with it in the organization? Essentially not made sure you do not fall in love with the solution, but rather stay focused on the problem.
I mean, I think that for us, success is defined as forward momentum, not getting the right answer or the wrong answer. And actually, what is a problem is standing still for too long. And so that people understand, as long as I'm moving, I'm doing what I need, that's, sort of success. I mean, I can think of endless examples of things that have gone wrong. I think most recently, we have a set of algorithms that we use on our matching platform that connect young people to job opportunities. We started to see some initial data to suggest that it wasn't quite working the way that we needed it to work. And we had to make a big decision, like, do we just stop and go back to matching in sort of less ideal ways? Do we try to pivot like in real time? And the decision was made actually to just stop. And that, that was a decision with kind of big consequences, but it didn't take long for people to understand, if I'm using the data and trying to understand what to fix, that's what success looks like. And within a few weeks, we're able to kind of try. I mean, we're in the kind of data collection process on this second iteration to see if we were able to kind of fix those things. So I think if the culture is clear that there's not punishment for failing, and it's always about, do your words match, your actions, people, I think, understand that just continuing to move forward is what is prized.
Incredibly, it sounds incredibly powerful when you get that right, particularly in times like COVID, where I think the organizations that have this DNA that enables them to change have really been able to shift and help their constituents. Thank you, and we'll come back. So I'm going to move on now to Valeria, but there will be in a moment the chance to ask questions. So please do start leaving any questions you've got or even thoughts within the chat, and we will be opening up in a moment for your thoughts and further questions. I'm sure there will be many for Maryana, because she has years of experience of doing this. There's actually not that many who've really achieved this scale, so delighted to have your experience on the call. Valeria, you're at the other end of the spectrum, which is really starting up with this new methodology. And we've loved working with you through the Catalyst 2030 network, and we're just so impressed at how quickly you got hold of some of these concepts and have been implementing them. But the reason we wanted you here is because it's fascinating to hear at the other end what it's like being introduced to this and using it for the first time. So I know, as co-founder of Overtourism solution, which transforms the tourism industry into a driver for sustainable development, you've been successful in Venice, and Valeria is on a journey to scale impact after her success transforming the experience of tourism there, making it more enjoyable for tourists and also more beneficial for the local community, economy, and heritage. So maybe you can share a little bit about the aspirations that we had when we started Spring Impact and yourself started working together with Catalyst 2030. What was the aim of introducing the lean impact approach?
Well, I think that I'm going to try to put it in my words, because I mean, that was really much an initiative that came from Spring Impact and the collaboration group of Catalyst 2030. I've been very lucky as organization and the other colleagues contributing that collaboration to benefit of. But I think the goal that you're pursuing is to allow and to demonstrate that methodology can be applied to collaboration, and to collaboration between people who might not have worked together before, because there's a big difference between collaborating with the people you're working with together all the time, and when you're collaborating within teams, even in a distributed way, and so on. So that's the feeling that I have. We wanted to see how we can do something together quickly by leveraging that methodology.
Definitely. So what's the problem you're focused on trying to solve?
So the problem that we're looking at is answering to two tensions that there is in tourism now, because we're looking at transforming tourism, like Dan was saying. And tourism is a gigantic industry. It was $8 trillion in 2019, like 10% of global gross GDP, growing faster than GDP for years until the COVID crisis, giving 330 million jobs around the world, many of which to people who are outliers, people who are marginalized, lots of women, or people with disabilities, and people who have no education and so on. And that was a gigantic sector that everybody thought would never know a crisis. But then came COVID, and the industry came to a complete halt. And so all those people, I mean, 100 million people were at risk of losing their job. On the other hand, if you think about tourism, you're like, okay, it brings a lot of job benefits to the community, it's great. But the reality is that there are a lot of hidden costs to tourism. And when you look at destinations that are successful, like here in Venice, you can see how it's being damaging to the economy, to the culture, to the heritage, to the environment. So there's a need to fix the root cause of tourism and adopt new models and new mindsets. So there's those two things, like tourism must restart and tourism must change. And so we were like, we want to contribute to that. So that's what we're doing as an organization, trying to transforming at the root. And through that collaboration, we were like, wait a minute, the tourism is shouldered by 80% of MSMEs. MSMEs are very much on the ground. They're the ones that are adopting the models because they don't know how to do otherwise, and they need help to be able to keep on providing livelihood to their owners, you know, whether they are being a single woman or a small family. So what we set out to do with it collaboration was to bring the complementary skills and resources and that we have, like we're working with Bridge for Billions, which is an online incubator. We're working with Pleverto, which is an online tool that is making collecting data through play easy, and us. So we are like the tourism expert side with a new model and so on. We're like bringing all of this together to empower people on the ground to build more resilient businesses that make a positive impact. And through the methodology, we were able to start through our ideation, although the problem was very well defined and there was not margin there. The teammates were very much, our roles were very clear. I mean, Bridge for Billions, as they say, they make a burger. They can't do something else as we are, like we built a model in terms of we must share, we're not going to do something else. Everybody had sort of a role that was predefined, which meant that there was sort of an idea from the get-go that was already in everybody's head. But by using the methodology, we were able to step back and think it, you know, in the context in which this product, this service is going to be built, is going to evolve. And what I really like about the lean impact methodology is how you look at risks. Because we often, as entrepreneurs, we always want to cut corners. We want to go fast, to move fast. I mean, many of us our age have a knowledge of the lean, but we don't necessarily really use it, right? We're like, yeah, okay, the lean, small pilots and some, we don't really necessarily really use it thoroughly. And through that methodology, by looking at the different risks, you should read the book, work with Spring Impact Team, but you really identify what are the risks that your solution is going to confront. Even though at the end, we're going to build the same solution, we're going to be much more able to bring that solution to success by having gone through the process. So I just wanted to insist on that. Like, yeah, maybe there's not much margin to change the solution you're going to build because the problem maybe is very well known. The teams, you know exactly what they're going to do, but that doesn't mean that you can't benefit from the methodology. Because like one of the teammates was saying, well, I have done many of such workshops on ideation. Valeria, we're going to build the same solution. Okay, and we can do it in 3 days. So what's the point? And I really realized that through that process, there was so much more that was brought to what we're building. And I really want to insist because there might be other people who are skeptical. Myself, I was skeptical. I was like, let's go with the process. And I'm happy that I went with it. And to add to Maryana's points, that we're carrying this methodology in everything we're doing now. We also were founded through tourism, right? We were selling tourism products and services and so on. That has stopped with the crisis. And without using the lean impact methodology, we would have never been able to push forward the other two projects that we're working on right now, one of which in co-creation with other organizations, if we didn't have that, because we wouldn't have had a bandwidth and the resource. So like, I really recommend everybody to give it a shot. I would recommend to do it with people to accompany you, because then you stick to it, you don't take the shortcut, because then you will never regret it. You'll adopt it just like Maryana has done. I really, really recommend you to do so.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Valeria. So it sounds like you're already applying it actually to various different parts of your work, which is wonderful. And it sounds like so bringing together a group and then thinking the risks was particularly impactful for you. So really outlining the individual risks to a solution working, and then working out which risk you're testing. Maybe can you share one of the experiments that you did? So if I understand correctly, you outlined a risk, you then designed an experiment to test that risk. Can you talk a bit about what one of the experiments was and the outcome?
Well, we've designed a very simple experiment. There was a landing page that we have created with a bit of friction. That was, I think, asking people to do an application, and that was inviting people to declare their interest into a program that we're building without giving them too much information. So we contacted people. We wanted to go as targeted as possible. So we contacted people through LinkedIn groups. You know, you go to LinkedIn groups, you can see who is a member and contact them, identify them, and then contact them directly there. And so we had predefined success metrics, so that they were all based obviously on conversion rate, because that's pure marketing, right? When it's a landing page, at the end of the day, you have to base yourself on what is in the industry, the average conversion rate, to be able to understand whether or not how you're doing. So that was a very simple experiment that way. We did meet our objective, but we did realize that not all the team were happy with the results, because something we did not define earlier is how many people we wanted to contact to be able to be happy with the results of the experiment. So now, when will we decide that the result was significant? Because we did meet our objective in terms of percentage, but when you look in absolute value, it was 3. And so you can be like frustrating with 3. So something that we've learned is that we need to communicate about this and like set not only the percentage that we want as an outcome, but to define it successful, but maybe exactly from which thresholds we will be considering successful, and also find better ways to access the people that we wanted to test. Because by using the technique that I was mentioning earlier, we kind of was doing hit and miss. So something that we learned through the experiment is, for example, a target customer, which we wanted to reach early stage entrepreneur, future entrepreneurs. We learned that maybe they're easier to find if we type into universities, because instinctively that's what we had been doing. And so now we brought somebody else in the team who is a university teacher. So we have direct access to students, and so we can test more easily.
Great, interesting. So still learning your way around how to define what success looks like. And it's interesting because it sounds like there's also the people that you're working with are learning the methodology as well. And so getting everyone on the same page and understanding it seems important. Thank you. Now, I don't know if there are any questions from the group. Either put your hand up and you can unmute yourself and ask a question, or type something in chat. If not, I have plenty more questions, but over to you. Any questions? Nick, do you want to unmute and ask your question, and then Siva?
Yeah, it was just a question to the panel with regards to these barriers to entry when you're creating an experiment. Is there too much friction? How do you sense that?
Yeah, it's a great question, Nick. To clarify what I mean by friction, the intention is not to like unnecessarily throw obstacles in people's way. The intention for the friction is to simulate the kind of friction that would be required, when you actually run the full scale thing, right? So, I often use the example of Tesla. When Tesla um, started and announced their Model 3 car that was supposed to be a more affordable electric car, um, a no friction experiment would be to just do a survey. Who likes this car, right? Who wants an electric car for $35,000? And you wouldn't get a very good read from that because it's very easy to say, yeah, sure, that sounds good to me. And like, would you really follow through? For them, friction was they put up a website and you could sign up to get on the wait list, but you had to put down $1,000 deposit. Now you could get that deposit back if you decided you didn't want the car, but it was friction that tried to simulate that you're really serious, right? It's not more friction than actually buying the car, but it gets you part of the way there so that the people that put down $1,000 deposit are going to give you a much better read of how many people are going to be interested in actually buying the car than just saying, raise your hand if this sounds good to you. So that's what I mean by friction. It should never be more friction than what the full-fledged solution will be, but tries to get as close to that as possible so you get an accurate read of what people's behavior will likely be when you offer the full solution.
Perfect, thanks.
I was going to think of, I have a practical example, Nick. I think of that. We ran an experiment around a training module to help young people build problem-solving skills. And we divided the group into two, and one had a traditional facilitator in the room, and the other group had to do it on their own without a facilitator. We didn't run it for long, and we discovered that the group that didn't have a facilitator performed at a actually better rate than the group that did, which was a really important insight for assumptions that we make about how young people are going to learn best.
That's great. Fascinating.
Thank you.
Really interesting. Thank you, Maryana. Siva, would you want to ask a question?
Yeah, and my question is to you. And what I understand is when we try lean, lean impact, or if you want to try some new idea in a short time, this looks for me, it is for a company which is doing something within the company and not outside the company, or it is for a company which is like established. So I'm trying to start a new company and new enterprise, and in my enterprise, what I'm trying to do is, or what I think is, I get one chance or a very less chance when I go public, and you lose your reputation when you do mistakes. So all I'm trying to do is to go back and make things right, so that I get a chance which I don't want to miss, and then people might not take my enterprise seriously. So this is where I'm stuck. How can I use your
It's a
link?
great question. So a couple things to clarify just about when experiments are appropriate. So it can be in a big established organization or in a new organization. The time that you want to run experiments is when there's high uncertainty, right? So if you've been doing something for a long time, you can pretty reliably predict what's going to happen. There's no reason to run an experiment. Then you're just trying to execute on that. But when you're doing something that's very new or different, and you have a lot of things that are uncertain, that you're not sure how they will play out, that's when experiments are helpful. And the idea is to reduce the risk before you make the big investment. And so in your case, if what you're trying to do is launch a brand new product, and of course you only want to launch once, and you want to have that big launch be successful, then you want to run some experiments in advance to make sure that launch is going to have the best chance for success as possible. And so one of the tools that people use, it depends on the kinds of risks that you might have. But one of the tools people use is if the kind of risk you have is one that really needs to be, sort of public facing, you could do it under a different brand, for example, right? You don't have to use your name. You're running an experiment. Think of the experiments as you're running an experiment with maybe 10 people, maybe 20 people. and you're showing them, an offering and seeing whether they'll sign up, or you're having them sign up for something and go through, receive a product or service and see what they do with it. Those are all things you can do without having a public launch and associating your brand with it. So identify what the specific risks you are that you are concerned about when you do the full launch, and then look for ways to narrowly define an experiment around that again doesn't have to put your brand at stake.
Okay, and I have a small additional question. How do I also motivate people internally to try out something new, like inside the team?
Yeah, I don't know much about your organization, but one of the things that I found is that people respond to the incentives that are put in front of them, right? So I see a lot of organizations who talk about innovate, we have to innovate, but then the incentives are all about how many grants did you win? What does our grant pipeline look like? How many people did you reach this week, right? And so the incentive people have, what they're rewarded on, what's reinforced for them is execution. Right. So if you want people to take risks, if you want them to try something new, the things that you need to incentivize people to do is to take those risks, to drive for performance. So for example, if you, instead of saying, we need to reach 1,000 people this week, if you say instead, we need to figure out how to increase our conversion rate from 30% to 70%, then people need to try something new, right? You can't brute force your way to doing that like you can to getting it to 1,000 people. So define the success in terms of improvement in some dimension of what you're offering, and then reward people based on that. Rewards can be financial, can be promotions and so forth. It can also be, a pat on the back, recognition at a company meeting or something.
Okay. Yeah, thanks a lot.
Great, very helpful. Thank you, Anne-May. We have another question. Alexandra, do you want to come off mute and ask your question?
Hi there. I was going to say my question was around lean data management. We're a small not-for-profit startup, and we've been trying to engage the principles of lean impact kind of over the last year and things. And I think one of the things that we're kind of always looking at and trying to work out how to do better is how do we keep a track of all of this valuable data that we're gathering? Do you have any recommendations for data management systems or kind of tips on how to do that? Because we don't really want to kind of lose the valuable data we're gathering, but we're not sure how to manage it.
I mean, Dan, I have a thought on that.
Go for it, yeah.
I don't think one can underestimate the power of Excel as one of the most powerful data tools in the entire world. And if I even talk now, I mean, we're in the millions. We model things in Excel before we try to build them into kind of other systems or do other things, because there is an enormous amount of power in that very simple tool, certainly for rapid kind of experimentation. So I see a lot of organizations getting way ahead of themselves on systems, ahead of what they need those systems for. And I mean, to this day, we do a huge amount on Excel before we would even move it into another system. I mean, if that's a helpful reflection.
Valeria, what do you?
I completely agree with Maryana, and I would just like to say, like, try to adapt the principle of lean everywhere. So you don't want to be going lean and then to manage your data from lean and create more bureaucracy, more systems and so on in your organization. Like we don't have a lot of data yet, but we've been using Google Sheets so that everybody can access, everybody can update, and then you can back up everything on the cloud. Maybe the key is just to have clear systems in the way you, in nomenclature, so you know what is it that you are experimenting when, and you can look back, and maybe just like a syntax that helps you follow up through the different experiments and when you have had them, rather than more systems. I mean, that's how I would go about it.
Very helpful, thanks, Valeria. And I saw Alexandra ask a follow-up question about Google Sheets versus Excel, which I think might be getting on the technical side. Depends how much you like pivot tables, but Excel is the ultimate, most powerful thing out there. So, but Google Sheets might do the job. We've got a great question here from Alexander. And Alexander, I don't know if you want to come off mute and ask this one, because I think it's one I'm asked regularly. So I'm interested to hear Anne-May's thoughts on it.
Sure. Thanks for the presentations and sharing your learnings. So within Dutch Development Corporation, since 2015, the focus shifted towards really investing in lobby and advocacy, changing laws and policies, regulations in globally, basically, and the focus countries of Dutch Development Corporation. I'm a big fan of Lean Impact for many years. I'm trying to embed it structurally now within the organization I'm currently supporting through our academy. But the things that I'm struggling with is how can we effectively try to explore how we can use the same methodology for more like complex issues around the lobby and advocacy, which takes time, relationship management, it includes people and slightly different approaches than straightforward product or service development. I'm curious if somebody, Anne or Maryana or other people in this room have some experience and could share some ideas, tips and tricks.
Yeah, it's a great question, Alexander. Certainly applying lean principles to things like advocacy, policy change, and so forth is going to look different than when you're working with a product or service. But the basic principles hold, which is that what you're trying to do is de-risk your investment, right? So if you're going to embark on a advocacy campaign that's going to take, you expect 5 years to reach fruition, you want to know before 5 years whether you're on the right track. And so the simplest thing I do is to start with the theory of change, right? So if you're, if the way that you're going to get the law passed is you need to get 51% of the legislators on board, for example, then one of the things that it might look at in the early stages is like, how compelling is this idea to legislators, right? Like, will they, how many of them will take a meeting? How many of them will sign on to co-sponsor the bill? Things like that are the early precursors that aren't going to guarantee success, but are indicators of the degree of appetite that's there. Another kind of thing that I use, I think can be powerful for advocacy, is a lot of times we want to go out and do a lot of research, right? And then we're going to take these research findings or collect a bunch of data or analyze a bunch of data and then use those to try to prove a point. I recommend that before you do the research, before you analyze all the data, that you fake up the results that you hope to get, right? So if you can show that, like, if we do this program, 20% fewer people will, fall into homelessness, whatever the thing is, right? Fake up what the result is, that the best case result is that you're looking for, and then show it to people and see, like, if we could show you this, what would you do? And so then if the answer is that doesn't matter, then you can save yourself all of the effort to do all the data analysis and research. So advocacy entails lots of different types of activities, but I think the key is to look at what's your theory of change, how do you hope to get from here to there, and then break down what are the biggest risks along the way and try to find ways to test for those.
I wonder if, thank you, Anne. I wonder if, Maryana, I know you've also been trying to work on the policy side. Have you successfully applied some of these principles to that side of work too?
I mean, I think what Anne said is spot on. I mean, the idea of like define success at the beginning is really important in work where, it's not as straightforward as like product or delivery or the like, and think about how you test small wins along the way. So if I think of an example, we work with our Department of Trade and Industry around how they incentivize private sector employers, and took a learning in one sector to say, how would this look if we applied it to other sectors? And I think exactly to Anne-May's point, try to figure out what the end result is before you spend time on a kind of a multi-year plan. See what it would take to change people's minds, and again, just be iterative in small ways.
One of the projects that I was mentioning we're currently working on using the Lean methodology is the creation of a multi-stakeholder, multi-level collaborative, and where we work with policymakers within other kind of stakeholders. And we are now, what we are retesting is engagement. And to do so, we craft a message and we test it through conversation, short conversation and so on. And we see how people react. And so then we can adjust it and then test again. And the next phase that we're looking at is to take those people that we have engaged and bring them around the table and test, something new, to make sure that we don't end up creating reports or any kind of products that would be the kind of product you create in advocacy that are going to land on the desk and are not being used. So it's really about engaging them, and to engage them, we test every single part of the language that we're actually able to create thanks to them feeding them to us, so feedback loop, and very nimble with messages, quick calls, that kind of things.
Thank you, Valeria. Any other questions? So we've got a few minutes left, and I would love to dive a little bit further into, I think, something that's become increasingly apparent as we've worked with more teams, which is that actually mindset, the way people think about their work, is one of the greatest blockers to being able to apply these principles. Anne-May, I wonder, could you share a little bit about the mindsets that you think are needed from teams delivering this to be successful?
Yeah, absolutely. The first thing that comes to mind is humility. I think that in the social sector, the reality is there's a lot of ego involved. People often get into doing this work because they believe they can make a difference and believe they have an idea for how they can do so. And letting go of that ego and being humble to recognize, like, there's a lot we don't know, both about the problem, and there's a lot we don't know about the solution, is really important to start with, to bring that humility to the table. And then, as we've been talking about, agility is so important, right? Being able to move quickly, turn on a dime. That's something that is not really in the DNA of most NGOs. That we have been trained over time, because of the way grant cycles work, because of the way programs are run, to really plan and then implement over long periods of time. So figuring out how we can speed up our decision making, our ability to pivot, and our ability to learn is important. And then the third thing that sort of goes along with that is letting go of perfectionism. I think there's something really baked into the culture of in the development space of, we have to figure out everything perfectly, right? We have to make sure that we have dotted all our I's, crossed all our T's before we even get started. And one of the ways I see that come to light is that, when we talk about evidence of whether something works, a lot of times people are like, we don't, in order to determine whether this works, we need to spend $1 million in 2 years to run an RCT, which makes a lot of sense for a very mature intervention that we're pretty sure works, to get that final rigorous kind of stamp of approval. But in the early stages of something that you're still figuring out is way overkill, and before you've actually validated that it works. So letting go perfectionism also means looking at smaller, taking smaller steps, right? So building up to that, not to say that RCT isn't important eventually, but before you run the RCT, let's make sure that people actually want your solution, and that if you're training farmers to, for example, improve their farming practices, and you want, in order to increase their incomes, you don't want to run an RCT to see if that they have increased their incomes before you've actually just gone over to their farm the day after you train to see whether they're doing anything differently. Because if they're not doing something differently, the RCT is going to fail, but you can find that out much easier. So looking for those smaller steps that allow you to see if something's working before taking some of the heavier weight steps.
No, that's great. I particularly like the one about perfectionism. I hadn't heard that before, and that really does resonate. I think it's very easy to get caught up in the perfect, when we just need to learn as quickly as we can. Maryana.
I like Mariana's phrasing of that, of forward momentum. That's really what people should be shooting for, rather than perfectionism.
Well, and Maryana, I mean, I'm sure many of these resonate. What have you found in terms of actually the practice of building a team to do this? What have you found sort of critical mindsets are when you're hiring people and developing them?
I mean, I think these are all learned. I don't think people have to come in, having necessarily, be experts at this. I would just add two things to what Anne-May has said. I think the first is that when people are trying new things, I think they need to feel not alone. And so in our case, when we do experiments, we're constantly checking in, because I think the risk of leaving people and then, at the end of the week, it's a disaster. Like they might feel worried. If we're checking in every day, it's like we're all on the journey together, and that there's a high level of alignment. And I do think that this idea of trying to play out what's the worst case scenario that you're most afraid of, and then play that out. And then in most cases, it's really not that bad if it fails. And so that it doesn't, to Anne-May's point about perfectionism, feel like this is do or die. This is like forward, we're moving. But in my mind, I think this sense of kind of regular alignment and not feeling alone, I think has been an important part of our kind of culture of experimentation.
That's great, thank you. And then Valeria, I know you're earlier, so probably these sort of mindset shifts are still very real. Interested to hear what some of the insights for you have been about the changes you've made.
Well, I think the biggest has been what Anne was mentioning at the beginning, that an experiment is not a mini pilot. It can be completely different, because we were like, oh, already an experiment. How do we manage to do a mini program? And then we were like, oh no, they can be a landing page, because this is just a way to test the risk, because you do that analyze of risk and you see how this, in the simplest and most minimal way, you can test it. And that's really an eye opener, because it's a big difference even to do a small pilot and putting together something in half a day. And so that's been the biggest mindset shift, because you understand that you can really embed it in everything that you do all the time. It doesn't have to be, it's Lean Impact months. No, it can be there all the time. And I think that really changed the way you operate in any ways at all levels.
Great, fantastic, thank you. I think we are nearing the nearing the end here, so maybe I can take a moment just to really give a huge thank you to each of the panelists. It's been fascinating hearing the journey each of you have gone on to really apply Lean to your organizations, and I'm excited to see where this goes, not only for Harambee, who are already at scale, but scaling even further. I know sounds like you're heading Pan-African now as well, and Valeria, who's earlier in the journey, but is already applying this to many areas of your work. So excited to see what the future looks like. Thank you for your time. Thank you also to Catalyst 2030 for not only organizing this session and some other wonderful content this last week, but if you aren't engaged in Catalyst 2030, strongly recommend you have a look at the movement. It's a really exciting network of social entrepreneurs and change makers trying to create systems change more broadly. So just want to give a plug there to have a look at it. And if you're interested in Lean Impact, obviously the first thing I suggest is you go out and buy the book if you haven't done that yet. It really is a fabulous read. And then we are working with a number of different organizations, not only within Catalyst, but beyond, to really think about how we apply these principles. And we're always happy at Spring Impact just to have an informal conversation, to talk through what you're doing, offer advice, and then we are working with a number of organizations as well. So feel free to be in touch. And just really appreciate you joining for the last hour. And I wish you all the best in your in applying Lean to your work and creating social change at scale. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a good afternoon, evening, morning, wherever you are in the world. Cheers. Bye.
Cheers. Thank you. Thank you.